to this episode of Higher Ed Matters, our podcast where we talk about all things really related to the higher education industry. But this is kind of a special episode because I started out and really early in my career met you, Tracee Duerson, Director of Admissions for the Theater School at DePaul University, in my admission counseling career, where we did a lot of financial aid counseling. And at the time of this episode recording, it's fall. We're coming up on the financial aid season for the next cycle. And we thought, I know you know Fran, who is also our other guest from DePaul University. Fran Cebrzynski is the Director of Financial Aid and Student Services for DePaul Central. Did I get that right, Fran?
Basically, it's kind of a dual role. Yeah, DePaul Central is one entity, and then we staff DePaul Central with the financial aid counselors.
Awesome. So brought some friends and experts together to do a special episode for students and families to talk a little bit about how to approach the financial aid process and how to kind of consider it within the context of your college search. So thank you so much to both of you for being here today.
Sure.
Thanks for having us.
You bet. So I kind of wanted to start with just some real basic questions. I want to talk about just the basics in terms of how do you get started with the financial aid process? What's kind of step one if we have students or families or prospective students, even adults, thinking about going to college, and what's step one?
Well, step one from my perspective, from the financial aid side of the house, is the FAFSA needs to be completed. So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid, and that's completed by students and parents to determine their federal eligibility, meaning federal Pell Grant and federal student and parent loans. That opens up on October 1st of every year, so the sooner you get it done, the better, especially if you're an incoming student, because we like to go out with awards earlier rather than later. So it takes things into consideration like demographic data, household size, number in college, and tax information.
Okay, so studentaid.gov. What are kind of the basics of things that someone would need to, if they're going to sit down at their computer and start that process? Is there things that would be helpful for them to kind of get in order before they start to fill out that form?
Well, it's not as difficult as it used to be before, because what the government introduced is what's called a transfer of their tax information from their taxes that they file right to their FAFSA.
Awesome. That's great. That's definitely changed since I was an admission counselor and when I went to school.
The paper forms.
I love to hear it. Tracee, what are some of the things that, from the admission side of the house, what are some of the early questions that you get from parents and families with respect to finances and financial aid?
Sure. I mean, it's always one of the first questions we're asked. Right. It's almost in conjunction with what programs do you offer and what kinds of scholarships can I get, right? Because the financial affordability is very big on everyone's minds, as it should be in this day and age. And so, what we always tell students and families is, as you're navigating the admissions and application process, certainly get in that FAFSA as soon as you possibly can. And then it's really just a matter of waiting until you see where you're admitted and what the award letters look like. But yeah, we definitely are navigating those questions all the time. And we really try to emphasize that don't let the financial part worry you too much on the front end. And we're going to talk a lot more about that once they are admitted and have those offer letters in front of them.
For sure. It's kind of interesting. I feel like financial aid almost has this almost like a negative connotation when it should be like the most positive part of the of the process. Yeah.
I mean, it's always financial aid's fault that they couldn't go to the school they wanted to go to, their dream school. Well, there's one thing I'll add on to what Tracee said, and that is the trend lately is they get admitted, they'll fill out their FAFSA, and even before they get their financial aid award, they're already sending in letters of appeal, special circumstances, saying, hey, this is what's happening now in my life, because on the FAFSA form, we're looking at prior year information. So their students and families are proactive, and they send in appeal forms before they even receive their award. So we take that into consideration, and when we process their award, I mean, depending if we made any changes to the FAFSA or not, that can make a difference.
I feel like that's been extra evident the last couple cycles, just because 2020 and everybody who was affected, from an employment status. And it's been really interesting to watch that happening, and just the people's urgency for ensuring that financial aid and admissions has that information so that they feel like they're being awarded at the level that is appropriate relative to job losses, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, totally.
Can we talk about that a little bit more in terms of appeals process and what that means for just for a student or a family that is like, I didn't even know that was a thing or something I could do?
Yeah, so the appeal process, we have I'm only going to speak for DePaul right now. So we have two different types of appeals. Non-income, non-expense, meaning, hey, I got my award, I just want more money or need more money. And a special circumstance with income expense, meaning we had a job loss. So can you make changes to the FAFSA to show the job loss and then revise the award?
Do you work a lot with students that are filing appeals and things like that? What are some of those conversations like?
Absolutely.
Sure.
Absolutely.
All the time.
Yeah. And especially like you said, this past 2 years has blown up. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that students, a lot of students are savvy to this process now, which is great. But then there's the flip side of the coin. There are a lot of families who don't even know that an appeal is possible. And that's something that I think all of us in the higher ed side want to get out the word about, because we want the lower income students, or just in that bracket where it can just be super tricky, to know that it's always worth an appeal attempt. It doesn't mean it's necessarily going to work out, but I feel like it never hurts to try in the big picture. And Fran, feel free to add or disagree.
Well, you're absolutely right. And it is typically like our lower income first gen students that do not appeal because they don't even know how to approach that subject. But yeah, that's the unfortunate part. The ones that really, really need to don't typically appeal.
Yeah.
Or they do it late in the process, which can sometimes be more complicated for them. But I will say, Fran, in our work together, Fran, like we've been really, I think it's been really exciting to see the students who we have been able to impact with the appeal process, on both the scholarship side, which is really the domain that I can have a little more control over with the way that we have funding available. And, and then what Fran can look at with their financial aid package, and the two of us together, have superpowers to make a big impact, and then we can bring in those first gen and or low income students. And that's just very rewarding and I think heartwarming on this side of the field to be able to see that happening.
Yeah, absolutely. I was a first generation college student and had I didn't know at that time, even being a transfer student, I started at community college and then transferred to a 4-year, and I didn't know that there was an appeal process. I probably missed an opportunity, right? And I guess that's one of the reasons we wanted to do this episode, because I think that there are just like it's not like they're secrets, they probably are on financial aid pages and there is information out there, but there just is, just the lack of knowledge of that there are pathways. And honestly, it sounds like the worst that you can say is no, right?
Exactly.
But you're still admitted, you still get the package, you just don't get any additional funding.
You're absolutely right. There are cases that we've had that it's kind of been like, oh boy, we really can't do anything here. But it doesn't hurt to ask. That's the thing. You have to just ask because you don't know. Yeah.
And I think that one of the things too, it sounds like both from the appeal and the FAFSA. Can we talk a little bit about why the timeliness of the financial aid process is so important?
If you get everything into us early, if you fill that FAFSA out on October 2nd and we get the results, we go out with our first batch of awards, let's say like in the beginning of January, then you'll get your award and then you have more time to compare your offers from other schools. So you want to get that in sooner than later, because if you don't get that FAFSA in until March, then you're already behind the 8 ball.
And similarly speaking, each state works a little bit differently, but I believe it's the case that, sometimes state grants are date-based, right? So you have to apply by X date in order to be eligible for consideration. And I think totally correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that is dependent upon the state.
You know what? That's a really good point. I forgot about that. And the thing with the state lately is we used to get a pretty good idea of when that deadline was going to be. But for the last 3 to 4 years, we're informed of the deadline, like, oh, we're out of state funding a day before it's done. So you definitely want to get that in sooner than later, because we never know when that cutoff date is going to be. It's been as early as March and as late as July.
And for those low-income students and families, that makes a big impact, right? Because that can be another $3,000 to $5,000 of free money that they're not paying back because it's a grant. And so, stacked with the Pell Grant and other aid, that can make or break it for them.
Yeah.
Oh, and it's actually, so for the 22-23 academic year, it's much more than that. So they raised the Pell Grants up to $6,895, and the MAP grant is now $7,200.
Wow. Yes.
So they bumped this up quite a bit. When we started doing just some of the calculations, for some of these students that get an institutional award, meaning a merit award and a DePaul grant, they're pretty close to covering. They have a lot less of a gap to cover.
And that gap is usually something that is packaged as a loan, which is in the news this week. Can we talk a little bit about loans and what those mean? I know that those get, certainly have a bit of a bad rap as well, but sometimes they are necessary and they're not as scary as some students or families think when they're sort of approaching the financial aid package.
Agreed. But the important thing to remember about loans is to borrow responsibly. So the subsidized loans, great loan. I mean, it builds up a student's credit, which is what they're going to need when they graduate and get into the real world. And provided you borrow just what you need and not what you want, you'll be fine.
And I think, too, just with the loans, what's important for students to remember is repayment is much more forgiving, I guess, in some ways, and maybe that's the wrong word, than it is in looking at perhaps a car loan or a credit card loan,
sure.
right? So, or a debt of that sort, because there's 10 years to pay it back. The interest rates are typically a bit better than they are on other types of loans, and they can be income-based. There's a lot of different avenues to explore. And I know, Fran, it would be great, too, if you could share a little bit more about consolidating loans for students into those repayments.
So when I meet with students and families and they have questions about the loans, the important thing to remember is that you don't want to go into repayment until you are absolutely done borrowing, because each note is a different interest rate. But when you're done borrowing, then you consolidate into one rate, which is typically going to be anywhere from about 3 to, I don't think it's been over 4.25. So that's what you want to do. So it's not that bad of a thing once you consolidate. And then, like you said, there are so many repayment options right now. And now with all the loan forgiveness going on and pause in payments and stuff, I mean, it's very different than what it used to be. So it's really just a matter of, calculating what you need, hold off with repayment, consolidate your loans when you're done, and it will be reasonable.
Yeah, that's great advice. I think that's what I did as well. I'm in one of those boats of like, I probably paid off my student loans like 3 years ago. And so you're like, ooh, man, I missed that repayment or the forgiveness on the loans. But I'm super glad that some students have access to it now, right?
I think everybody's so pleasantly surprised about it actually happening, because any bit of help for any of us who have ever had loans is much appreciated.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. And I think it's going to help many people.
For sure. So let's go back to kind of the more traditional student, cycle, which is, again, we're kind of, getting all of that started for the next incoming class that would start, next fall. What are the best questions that a student and their family could ask a college that they're considering about finances and cost?
Well, I think the best question for them to ask, and ask it early on, is what the sticker price is. So you'd be surprised how many families, in fact, I just talked to one the other day, there are students starting at DePaul, and their first question to me was, wait, what is the tuition? So this is not a great time to be asking that question.
Sure.
So they need to ask about sticker price, what all the costs are right from the get-go, so that they have a good idea of what they're looking at.
Yeah, and I'm going to add on to that when they're asking that question, also asking what types of aid is available, both, merit and scholarship and all of the things that go into that, because there's always the one side of like, oh my gosh, the sticker price is terrifying, and then the hopeful immediate follow-up of like, yes, but let's see what that shakes out financially with all the aid that's available to you.
Yeah, exactly. That was going to be my point number 2. So yes, it's going to cost you $42,000 to attend, but here's what we have to offer. If you fill out that FAFSA, we know we can count on student loans. You have the FAFSA on file. should something happen throughout the year, we can always make changes to the FAFSA based on special circ. So you kind of have the bigger conversation about piecing things together.
Right. And not necessarily write off a school because of the sticker price as well, right?
No, not at all. And these are conversations I've had with parents. Every year is different. You don't know what a year is going to bring. So, part of the FAFSA is I've talked with families that are like, no, I'm not going to complete that. I make enough money. We're not going to get anything. Well, I can't tell you how many times I met with families and I've said, hey, but you just have it on file because you never know what can happen. People have lost their jobs throughout the year. So they have that FAFSA on file. So I'm able to make changes to the FAFSA and now they're eligible for funds.
Right. And to that same point, they don't have to accept the financial aid, right? They can get the loan offers and whatever else and just say, no, thank you. So, yeah.
And gosh, since you now can just import it, that's great.
It's so easy now.
That's like the best news I've heard all day.
It's even easier after year 2, 3, and 4, because then most of it's already pre-filled.
Right.
So it's really just a quick update.
Absolutely.
And I'd say similarly from the admissions perspective on that, don't eliminate a school from your list of where you want to apply because you're afraid it's going to be too expensive. There's just, again, no way to know until you see the whole full picture at the end. And so I always just get so sad when somebody's like, never, $60,000 a year, absolutely not.
There's just no way. And there probably will be, right?
Exactly. And if there's not, then tell us no. That's
Right.
fine. We're happy to we in all of my years of working in this field, I will happily encourage a student to go elsewhere if they feel like that's the better financial fit among any other reasons. And that's great and fine and wonderful, but don't, say no from the get-go, because you just never know until you have everything in front of you.
You're absolutely right. Tracee, it's kind of like what we do when we have our meetings with students. They're like, well, we can't make this work. So then we start thinking about, well, how can you make this work? We'll get, housing, let's not take the most expensive housing on campus. Let's go for something a little bit low, so there's conversations to be had about how it can work.
Exactly. And I think what's so important for students and anyone listening to this to know is please connect with people at the university, whether it be in admissions and or financial aid, because without, having those conversations with real people, then they may not even know that that's a possibility. But it really can make a big impact by making small adjustments.
So it sounds like if a student is, kind of considering, later on in the process, at least for this cycle, right? Like once they get admitted, they get their financial aid packages, that really just having a upfront conversation with the admissions counselor and or the financial aid counselor, at a particular school, just to say like, here's kind of, like what kinds of things would they kind of bring to that conversation? Like I can afford this school if my financial aid package would equal X. Like what kind, I think that even just knowing how to approach a admissions counselor or a financial aid counselor about the conversation about money could be helpful.
Oh, I completely agree. I mean, they do reach out to both our admission office, our traditional admission office and financial aid, and we work in tandem with the admissions office, because when they reach out and say, hey, we got these competing offers, so then they hand it off to us, then we kind of look at their FAFSA and be like, okay, can we give them a little bit more? Every school sends out their awards a little differently. So then we're like, okay, we can give you a little bit more. We may not be able to fill the gap or give you 100% need, but we can help with a little extra grant money.
When you're considering like the financial aid package for a particular student, and the choice of school, there's all these other costs to think about as well, like just the daily living kinds of costs. What kind of advice do you give students when they're, when you're talking about like, well, what else? Like, so I have my financial aid package and I think I know what that's going to look like. What other things do families kind of need to be preparing for now for their student to start college next fall that might not be covered by the financial aid package?
Yeah, so what we call that is direct cost versus indirect cost. So direct cost to the university is tuition fees, room and board. Indirect costs include books and supplies, personal and miscellaneous, and transportation. So that's all, we build that up into the cost of attendance. So we take that into consideration. We have a standardized cost of attendance. And so when we meet with families, we're like, okay, this is what your aid is going to cover. This is your direct cost, tuition fees, room and board. Anything else that you want to cover primarily is going to have to be with loans. Because if they want to cover, getting some money to buy food somewhere else other than on campus, since the institutional aid is restricted to charges at the institution, then it's typically loan funds that they're going to have to take if they want to cover above and beyond and to get money to then help their students do whatever it is they want to do, like I said, with buying food or whatever personal miscellaneous they have.
Mm-hmm. And we talk a lot too about students getting jobs, student worker positions on campus,
right.
and how much that can impact their overall out of pocket expenses or what they're able to contribute, and just being really mindful for many students and sometimes their families. This is the first time they ever have to consider a budget of any sort, right? And so just giving them tools and having conversations with them about best way to maximize your loans and whatever income you're making from your job, and not spending it all on partying every weekend or whatever the case may be, on too many, treats and outings to the movies, whatever the case may be. It's just important for them to learn early on, and also to just be mindful of not getting caught up in credit card, opportunities / scams, because that's going to have a lifetime of pain.
Exactly.
Yeah. But we do have, so what, at DePaul, what we have is when we meet with families, so the summertime is our orientation sessions. So we meet with families, and what we have is what's called a bottom line worksheet. So we sit down with families and we go over what their direct costs are. We show them what their institutional aid is, factor in their loans. And so then we can also show them what they will pay out of pocket. And then if we factor in the large amount of the parent loan, then we show them what would be refunded to them to help their students. So it's a very thorough process.
Yeah, that sounds really helpful. Are there any other resources, Fran, for folks that are listening that are good, either websites or just other resources where they could get some of these additional kind of questions answered, or step-by-step sort of instructions on how to start the process?
Well, I honestly, I would point them to the studentaid.gov. I mean, they have really, the Department of Education has done a wonderful job with revamping their website and the information that they post. I mean, it's really, really helpful. So I always point parents and students back to studentaid.gov. They can, most of their questions can be answered.
Yeah. Are there scholarship services through the studentaid.gov, like in terms of like external scholarship searches, or is there another site that you find credible and, to search for those things from a general perspective?
Yeah, that one gets a little tricky. So that's kind of state by state.
Okay.
I know that in Illinois, ISAC was using, our Illinois Student Assistance Commission was using a site called FastWeb, and that would link students up to lots of external opportunities to apply for external scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend to students because once upon a time I was a high school, college career counselor, and I would always recommend to students that start local, right? So are there scholarships you can earn through your high school first and through your community, and then look at the state level, and then look at the national level? Because, it's amazing if you get the $50,000 Target scholarship that 2 students get a year, but it's more amazing if you get something from the Rotary Club or whatever other community organization there is. So, and those, what I always tell students is those can add up quickly. And my big, I guess, soapbox is you spend an hour or two applying for a scholarship, you get $2,000. When are you going to next make $2,000 in an hour or two, right? Like hopefully someday, but that's not likely. So it is absolutely can feel daunting, but worth the time and investment to get those smaller scholarships.
I have seen more and more local scholarships, students with, like you said, $1,000, $2,000. That's when we talk about this. That's what we're piecing together. So no, you may not get, we can't give it all, but I mean, piece it together and you'd be surprised at how close you can come to that gap.
I also took this advice away from another forum that I participated in that said, think of basically spend 10, 15 minutes writing down qualities and characteristics about yourself, and then plug those into Google and see if there's scholarships. So I'm left-handed. I'm a twin. I love Dungeons and Dragons, and you may be amazed at what you will find that are scholarships. Again, don't pay to apply to those scholarships, but it is interesting how those can really add up over time.
Yeah, that reminded me of like whenever I was also working on with students directly. that it was also like figure out like what connections you have, like your parents' employers, your church, or even just a organization that your family's been involved. Like there's those kind of like hidden scholarships that just by nature of you being affiliated or your family being affiliated can, kind of easily be awarded. Well, this has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Fran and Tracee, for joining me today. And we look forward to another, great financial aid year and see what happens.
See what happens. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
You bet.